Hi, everyone. Welcome to this plenary session. Please find a seat if you haven't, or come in and join us. It's lovely to be here together at the Center for Jewish History. My name is Josh Lambert, if you don't know me. I am, what can I tell you? I'm a professor at Wellesley College. I'm a literary scholar, and I think I found out a while ago that the best way I could annoy other literary scholars is to hang out with historians. So that's what I'm doing here. And I'm very, very glad to be here for this event with two writers who I admire very much. And I think the plan for this event is I'll introduce these two writers. We'll talk for a while, 45 minutes or so. And then at that point, we'll turn to a Q&A session. All of you got cards as you came in, so be thinking of questions you want to write down. Please be unfettered and free with your questions because you'll be anonymous, so you can ask anything. You don't have to be embarrassed. And we'll go from there. So that's the plan. I don't think that these writers need all that much introduction because I think they're well known to most of the people in the room, but I will say a little bit about them. Gary Shteyngart, on my left, that's my left hand, is a writer of many different genres. I haven't read your poetry. I don't know if it exists. But beyond that, he wrote a book that I'm sure you all know well, just an incredible memoir called Little Failure, many, many novels, some short stories, I guess, and prolifically and gorgeously works in the essay form, writing complicated, interesting, and very, very funny essays and, sort of travel essays, all sorts of things. Many novels, of which, you probably have your different favorites, and we could do a poll later to see which are your favorites. And what else should I say? And is one of the people who's known, I think one of the things you could emphasize is known for his generosity in the literary world. So known for his generosity with blurbs that there became an entire sort of mini industry of studying the blurbs that he wrote. But I think that his generosity in showing up and talking to people has been something that I've heard a lot of people talk about. Our other panelist is Lara Vapnyar, another incredibly distinguished novelist, writer, who's the author of, if I'm counting right, 4 novels? Does that seem right, or is it 5?
4, I think.
4, okay, we'll say 4, and we'll have someone check later. And 2 collections of short stories. And what I learned and didn't really realize until I was spending a little time on Google before this event is that you really had started out in screenwriting. That was like an initial sort of appeal to you. So I think it's interesting to think about how much you've thought about that different field as well and done some work in that. But of course, we're here at this conference to talk about New York and its place in Jewish history. And I thought, by way of starting, I would just ask you both to think a little bit about, obviously, part of what you've done a lot of writing about is your immigration experience. But I wonder if you can think back to what you knew of New York before you came to the US. Was it something people talked about? Was it ignored? Were there stories about it? Did you have any vision of it?
I came to New York as an adult, so I had more time to develop my imagination of what New York would be like. And I imagine New York not as this extremely diverse place with all these areas that are unlike each other, but I imagine the entire New York City as a Times Square. And the first place I came to was Times Square, and it was exactly like I imagined.
That's funny. Yeah, I would say I was 7 when I came here, and we would watch, television reports on Soviet television, and they would just paint New York as this hell. Which I guess in 1979 there were, some problems, mostly in Times Square. But there was definitely a feeling, homeless people, everybody was, the workers kept trying to rise up against their masters. Also not entirely inaccurate, but there was this feeling of something very kind of dirty and dangerous. And I think in some ways, so we were from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and then we spent half a year in Rome. That my generation of Soviet Jews did that. I think Lara's did not. It went straight to...
Straight to Times Square.
Straight to Times Square. The plane landed in Times Square. So we saw Rome. We lived in Rome for half a year. And for my mother especially, I remember after St. Petersburg, which is a pretty city, and then Rome, we went to Queens. And this was such a letdown for my mother. I don't think she ever recovered. And she's still like, why? Why did we come here? So that was our sad journey, you know.
I wanted to ask about that too. Like, you know, do you have memories of what the city was like when you first got there? You say Queens was so bad, but I think for some of us who haven't spent a lot of time there, I'm curious, you know, how is it different from where you had been, especially as a kid or even as an adult, to like be in the city? What do you remember from first impressions?
Oh, well, I remember, and I wrote about this, I think almost spent pages writing my first impressions when we landed here. It was, for me, even though my mother was very saddened by Queens, for me it was a sense of amazement. Everything was bigger than in Russia. The cars were gigantic. I couldn't believe the size of the cars. The overpasses in Queens, you know, when you go down the highway, Long Island Expressway, whatever it was, and the car just curves around like this. I mean, maybe in Moscow you had this, but we didn't have this back in Leningrad. And just the scale of it was so crazy. It was like a science fiction. I was already in love with science fiction back in the Soviet Union. And this felt like it was a different world. And then also houses in Queens, I couldn't understand that each family had their own little house with a backyard and a front yard. That seemed impossible. How could a family just live in its own, you know? And then I realized some of their dogs had their own houses, dog houses. Even the dogs had their own private property. It was absolutely shocking.
How about you?
I had a very different impression of New York. I think even though Gary and I are of similar age, when I read his novels, I identify with the parents because I came here as an adult and my experience is closer to Gary's parents rather than Gary as a child. So for me, we were in this very ugly area of Brooklyn with like ugly brownstones. And I was pregnant and very sensitive to smells. And I think I would have hated smells everywhere. But for me, my first impression that Brooklyn smelled of fried onions. Everywhere I went, when I looked out the window for a breath of fresh air, it would smell like fried onions. It was probably a wrong impression, but that's what it was, that New York was kind of nauseating. But then everything was nauseating for me at the time.
Did something happen to change and like connect you to the city at some point? Like, was there something that, as time went on, made you feel more at home, more connected to it?
For me, it was a very long process. I felt extremely not at home for like about 5 or more years. And for me, the only moment when I started to connect to the city, to people who spoke English, was when I started writing. And maybe I started writing precisely for that reason, so I could connect.
Wow, interesting. Well, you know, this goes to what the definition of New York is. I guess Queens is New York, right? But we were living also, I mean, there's also many different Queenses. Right now, I think parts of Queens are some of the most interesting parts of New York, but we were in the very, very far end of Queens. And so there was a time when I didn't realize where Manhattan was. And I thought there's a couple of buildings on Queens Boulevard where my grandmother used to live in Rego Park, these 3 towers. I thought that was Manhattan, those 3 buildings, because we were not allowed anywhere near Manhattan. My parents were scared to death. I guess it was all the Soviet television showing all the crime in Manhattan, so we never went there. And I had a very, you know, it was almost like I was living in New York, but as a provincial. like a peasant of some kind. Because I was sentenced to 8 years of Hebrew day school for a crime I didn't commit, but and so I would go, to central Queens from eastern Queens, and that was pretty much all I knew. And then I think when I really found New York was when I went to Stuyvesant High School, which is a kind of math and science high school for chiefly Asian and some Russian students. And that's, to me, that's when I discovered Manhattan and fell in love with Manhattan very, very quickly. And even though when I was growing up, I just wanted to move to Long Island or some suburb, that was the dream for everybody in our Hebrew school. But that changed very quickly when I saw Manhattan. Yep.
And am I remembering right that at some point, especially when you started to publish, you were living in Staten Island? Was that where you moved initially, or was it later that you ended up there?
When we first came to New York, right after Times Square, we moved to Brooklyn and lived there for a couple of years. And then when my son was born, we moved to Staten Island, and there my daughter was born. And it was a place that was so different from New York. It was basically like a country place. It's not like a city place at all. And I loved it because I loved the sea, I loved my walks around Staten Island. But to keep my sanity, I needed to come to Manhattan at least once a week. And I felt about Manhattan that it was something wonderful, completely wonderful, but something where I didn't belong at all. Like about Staten Island, I felt like the same. I didn't feel like I belonged to Staten Island either. And that was a period in my life where I didn't belong anywhere. But both places were important to me. Staten Island for its nature, and Manhattan for being a real city.
And I guess I should ask, in the context we're in, did the city feel Jewish to you? Did it feel like a Jewish place? Was there a way in which you associated being there with Jewish life or Jewish people or Jewish experiences?
I just want to add to what Lara was saying about not belonging. I think not belonging is very important for a writer or an artist.
Yes.
And very Jewish too. Right, so from both sides, I think that really works well. I tell my students, we both teach at Columbia, and I tell my students, if you've had a happy childhood, just keep walking over to the business school, good luck. Or social work, whatever the hell you want to do. But here at the School of the Arts, we need miserable people. So I think it's important not to belong, and I think not belonging creates an opportunity to look at things from an outsider's point of view that gives you a very different view of the world and of society, and that's very helpful. As for Jewishness, as I said, yeah, I mean, my very first experiences in New York were all Jewish. My father was very into Judaism, and he would protest outside of synagogues in Leningrad, which was a very dangerous thing to do, obviously. My mother didn't really care. She was half Jewish. She didn't really care. But my father was very into being Jewish. And he went to an Orthodox synagogue. And I think the first thing he did was give money to Rabbi Kahana's JDL, JDF, whatever the hell it was. We didn't have any money. We were on welfare at that point, but he scraped together $100 to give to this cause that he was very interested in. So, and then, of course, I was sent to Hebrew school. Then also I was circumcised very poorly. For those who read The New Yorker, you may have read a certain essay I'd written about that. Also features in Little Failure and in Absurdistan, one of my novels. So it's a consistent theme. To be honest, by the time Solomon Schechter School was over, I was running as fast from Judaism as I could into the arms of Stuyvesant, where everybody was from somewhere else. I wasn't the only person who was an immigrant. Almost everybody was an immigrant. So my experience, I associate Judaism, I think, very much with Queens and Eastern Queens, where I grew up, and then Manhattan became this sort of polyglot, real home for me.
For me, it was a little different. Like Gary mentioned, it was dangerous to do anything connected to Judaism in Soviet Union. And some people were brave, and they did it. They went to synagogues, even though they could be fired from their jobs for doing that. But my mother, like I was brought up by a single mother. She was scared of everything, so she would not talk of anything Jewish in my family. And she even prohibited my grandmother to give a Jewish funeral for my grandfather because she was afraid of what the neighbors would think or say. And I'm not judging her. She was completely right to be afraid. And so when I came here, and my first book is called There Are Jews in My House, I had deep connection to like Jewish themes and Jewish issues, but I also felt ashamed that I didn't know enough about Judaism or Jewish history. And when I was invited everywhere to talk about my book and getting these Jewish prizes, I felt like an imposter. I felt like I did not deserve it because I was not Jewish enough. Even though I'm fully Jewish and I care deeply about Jewish issues, my ignorance of like some important moments of history in Jewish religion was making me feel like an outsider in Jewish community as well.
Do you feel like maybe possibly like the kind of cohesion or the sense of New York as a Jewish place would have added to that sense of outsiderness in that, like in smaller places, maybe there's less of like a buildup of like, you know, people know the history, they know these references, they have these shared senses of things, or do you think it would have happened to you no matter where you ended up?
I'm not sure because I can't compare to experience that I didn't have. Yeah. But what is strange now that I think that I feel completely comfortable with being Jewish and knowing what I know and not knowing what I don't know. But people often say to me things like, but you only think that because you're Russian. And once again, I feel like an outsider.
Well, this is probably, I don't know, the capital of the diaspora Jews, so if you can't feel comfortable here, I don't know what's left, you know. Such a huge proportion of the population is Jewish and Russian Jewish that I feel like this is like, I don't know, the third Rome of Jews or the third Jerusalem or something. So I never felt uncomfortable being Jewish here. And I think that is a somewhat generational difference between me and my parents, who are always sort of on, as you were saying about your mom, they're always on tenterhooks about, oh, was that a slight? Was this? And knowing the lay of the land here, I just, generationally, I've never felt that way. I'm shocked when I meet somebody and they're not Jewish. I'm like, what the hell happened, you know? You're in New York, you know? So I never felt that way.
I'm curious, like, to try to get a sense of your identities. Like, do you identify as New Yorkers at this point, having spent so many years here? Do you feel like when you go other places, you project that identity? You sort of say that's who you are, that's where you're from, or not so much?
That's very interesting because it's much easier for me to identify as a New Yorker than to identify as an American. I'm not sure how American I am. I feel that not fully, but I'm 100% a New Yorker.
Yeah, I agree 100% to your 100%. When asked, when I go abroad to do book tours and stuff, and I'm asked, you know, the whole litany of identities, Russian, Jewish, American, New Yorker. New Yorker is the one that feels the most honest in a way because, but lately that's been changing. 10 years ago, I now spend half the year upstate New York, so I'm becoming a kind of gentleman farmer. I raise mint.
I raise mint too on my windowsill.
So you see?
So New Yorkers can also
Ex-Soviet New Yorkers raise mint is the one takeaway that you can write about in your journals. Yes, so now I do feel, I learned how to drive a car. Do you know how to drive a car?
No.
No, okay, so I learned because upstate you have to. I'm not good at it, but I did learn to drive a car, and that made me feel more American.
Right, that's less New Yorker.
That's less New Yorker.
Yeah.
That made me feel much more American because I go to the mall and I buy the gigantic thing of toilet tissue, Charmin, the family pack it's called. and I stuff it into my trunk, and that feels very American, because I just saved some money on the family size. So. USA.
Is it American though, or it's something like Russian? To store a lot of toilet paper.
To store a lot of toilet paper. You're right. No, that's true.
It's a place where the
That's
cultures
true.
come together.
It's the beautiful coming together of all these cultures, but in an upstate context. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, if it's not uncomfortable, about your kids and how they think of themselves, because you both have kids. I'm not like totally making that up, and they grew up mostly in here, right, in the city, close to it, and I wonder if you see them seeing themselves as New Yorkers in a different way than you see yourselves as New Yorkers? Does that make sense?
I always assumed both my kids were born here. And I always assumed that they, unlike me, felt fully American. But when I asked them when they were like in their teens, whether they feel more American or more Russian, they said that they felt 50% American, 50% Russian. I don't understand why and how it is possible. That's what they said.
Wow.
Well, you must have brought them up speaking Russian, right?
Yes,
That's, I
and
think,
my mother taught them how to read and write in Russian. I wouldn't have the patience to do that. If not for my mother, they wouldn't be able to do that.
That's interesting. One of the most moving things, and I wasn't expecting this when my kid was born and I was presented with his birth certificate and it said, born in New York. I don't know why, it just made me so happy to see, that he wasn't born in the crappy country I came from and he was born here, although God knows what'll happen to this country too, but it just made me made me feel very touched when that happened. And he is so freaking American. My wife is Korean American. She was born in California, but her parents are Korean. And so she wanted me to raise him both in Russian and Korean. And I said, this is even before the war in Ukraine, I said, that country has no future. I know the culture is great, etc. But if we're going to concentrate on one language, Korea, which is a country I visit quite often with her, that has an incredible future and an incredible present, So if we're going to concentrate, I don't know, I guess kids can learn more than one language, but I really felt that, and I guess in school he's learning Spanish, so that would be 3 languages, that's too much. So I was very happy when he can write and read in Korean, and when we go there, but I'm not even allowed to go back into Russia. I'd written some stuff about Putin, and I was stopped at the airport at one point, thankfully, at the airport. But, so I feel I can't even take him there. So what's this for? So I think my own estrangement with Russian culture is very much a part of his own identity. And I think if asked, he would probably say, well, I'm part Russian, but Korean is what I identify with most.
One of the many years ago, I wrote a review of Absurdistan and Memoirs of a Muse together for the Globe and Mail in Canada. And I think what I concluded at the end of that piece was that in those books, at least, which I know is a long time ago, what your characters at least were experiencing was that unlike sort of Eastern European Jews who came to America 3 generations, in the 1890s or 1910s, for whom the suburbs and a material success had become a kind of disgusting, repulsive thing to run away from, coming from the experiences you'd had, or at least for your characters, a house in the suburbs, a good living, a comfortable life, didn't seem like such a terrible thing to experience. And that was my reading of like sort of how those books were finding their place. I think probably I'm wrong about that, but I'm curious, does that seem right as a way of understanding what was going on for you in those early works? Do you think on some level you were more attracted than most even writers around you to the idea of a suburban American life, a kind of middle class or upper middle class level of success than a lot of sort of writers who are railing against that?
That's actually a very interesting question because I was in English class in my graduate school, wonderful professor Nancy Miller, and I don't remember which book we were discussing, but she said something like this, that no one ever aspires to be middle class. Like people from middle class aspire to be rich, and rich people think their lives are so boring they aspire to be poor, and middle class is for no one. And I raised my hand and said, oh, immigrants aspire to be middle class. It's exciting, it's fun. I remember how I was, and it's kind of also awful when I think about it now, it's embarrassing, how I was learning to play tennis and to ski among all these recent immigrants from China, from India, and we were all these awkward, out-of-shape women trying to fit in into American middle class through what we assumed were important attributes of American middle class, like skiing and tennis. And we were so bad at it. And I don't know about these other women, but I dropped attempts to learn any of this after, I don't know, 2 or 3 classes.
That's really funny. Yeah, my kid loves tennis and, wait for it, golf. So he may be aiming for the upper class. He needs other parents for that. But yeah, I love the middle class. What a great class. Give yourselves a hand. Good class. Middle class. Whew. Yeah, but it does take immigrants, which is why this whole country runs on immigrants, because somebody has to come in here and strive to be middle class, and that generates the kind of work ethic that keeps us always #1. Yay. So I agree. And also being poor, when I was a kid, when I came here and I was 7, 8 years old, and I remember even in the Hebrew school, I only had one shirt from some Russian shirt factory. Shirtsk was the town it was made in, maybe. And the administrators of the school started a clothing drive for me. So everyone gave in clothes that they were no longer wearing. And I would wear clothes, and kids would be like, hey, that's my shirt, So when I was growing up, I was like, I gotta be rich here, because that's the only way, because it was very, very traumatizing to be that poor in a society where, this wasn't, Sweden, where some form of egalitarianism still exists. It was who you were was determined by how wealthy you were or how poor you were. It's almost like in America, it's almost like a Calvinist predestination thing. You are to blame if you're poor, and we were really poor. So I really wanted to kind of crawl out of there. And in Stuyvesant, when I was in high school, I really wanted to, become a doctor or a lawyer, the same thing my parents wanted me to be. But then I followed this girl to Oberlin College, a wonderful Marxist college in Ohio. And there I learned to disdain the middle class for at least the 4 years I was there. I remember I used to work, and my dad used to be an engineer at Brookhaven Laboratory on Long Island, and he got me a summer job there as a janitor, but it paid $15 an hour, which back then was a crap load of money. And so I had a whole janitor's outfit. It said Gary in cursive here. Oh. I know, cute. But then I ended up at Oberlin, and there was a guy named, and he wore a janitor's outfit 24/7, and it said Bob on it. And I said to a friend, I said, geez, poor Bob, I wish somebody had, give him some, and my friend said, no, his name is John, he's the son of a billionaire. He's just wearing that shirt. What you were saying about the rich wanting to be poor, he's like, he thinks it's like workers chic to constantly wear a janitor's outfit with the wrong name on it. So to me, that was like my final understanding of what America is and how, perhaps, yes, I could never fit in no matter what I did.
Thinking that we're in front of an audience of historians, they like to think about historical change. And I have been thinking about, that's what you do, right? I don't know. That's what they told me in grad school. I'm thinking about how much has changed since you started writing. You both started publishing right around the turn of the millennium, at a time when we didn't have smartphones yet. There was no YouTube. There was barely Google. The publishing industry has changed sort of massively in those years, and I'm curious if you can reflect a little bit on how what you do is different, what you aspire to accomplish has changed, or if actually it doesn't matter to you at all and you just do what you do.
Well, when I published Russian something, Debutantes, that was the first book I wrote, and that was partly a response to, I would go to a bookstore and I would see nothing from my generation of ex-Soviet Jews. I thought that was a real, given our great literary tradition. So I was very eager, and I thought, you know, there was great books already by, well, my mentor Chang Rae Lee wrote Korean American fiction, Junha Diaz did Dominican American fiction, Jhumpa, I think, no, maybe, yeah, Jhumpa came first, did all kinds of Indian American fiction was coming out. So I really wanted to, you know, start working on that because I thought we had a story to tell. Very thankfully, right after that book came out, Lara and David Bismozgis and a whole bunch of people started writing, started publishing books. So it became kind of a trend almost. I think there was an article about a little trendlet that, remember that?
I hated that they always group us.
We always,
together.
I know, we're such different writers, but we're always, so for me, one of the main things was just to be able to tell the story of my generation of Russians. And once I did that, which I thought with after my memoir, I was like, okay, enough already, you know. And then I was able to, I mean, I would still have Russian-American characters, but I was interested in technology, for example. So Super Sad True Love Story was about technology. Lake Success was about finance, and it's chokehold on New York in a way. So all the books became about subjects other than me being Russian Jewish. Now, I teach a class on immigrant fiction at Columbia, and what I find interesting in terms of publishing and sales is that you are always lumped in as, you're pigeonholed as whatever, you know, so probably you feel the same way, you're the Russian person. So my least selling book was the one that had 0 Russians. Lake Success sold far less than almost any of my other books, because I think some of the critics were like, what the hell, he's not doing Russians anymore. And I'm like, well, don't I get, this is the question of like how American you feel. I'm like, don't I get a say in America? You know, no, apparently not. Or not as much as when I'm the Russian guy. So I think in some ways, you know, as I grow older and become more entrenched in this country, and also now that I live upstate, as I become more able to buy family-sized packs of things and put it in the trunk of my fine automobile, I feel like my purview is expanding, and I don't need to write about the same things anymore, but yet that's what they want, right? So, you know.
For me, it was, beginning of my career was like a miracle. I barely spoke English. My third short story I've ever written in my life was published in the New Yorker in the debut issue. And I remember that my editor told me that like the story comes out tomorrow, your life will never be the same. Everyone will know your name and things like that. So the next day I go to a gallery, to an art gallery with my friend, and the gallery is empty. There are just 2 women at reception, and they're discussing New Yorker debut issue. And they say, did you see the Russian story? I mean, it's so awful. New Yorker standards are just going down. And so, yes, I woke up famous. People were talking about me the very next day. And it was such a miracle to me, not in terms of even professional success, but in terms of personal success. I started to take myself seriously, not as a writer, but as a person. I accomplished something. It was amazing. And then there was like this moment of enormous success, huge advance for my first novel, which was awful. That was Memoirs of the Muse that you reviewed. It was like the worst of my novels and probably like close to the worst novel ever written. So I had the most success with my worst novel, the least success with my best novel, which I consider to be not just my masterpiece, but let's be honest about it, a masterpiece. And I realized it used to be very painful, but now I realized that I don't care. I really don't care about like a formal part of a success. It took a lot of pain to come to this understanding. I just want to be able to write whatever I want. You see, lack of success allows me to do whatever I want. Because what is the point of writing something for them that they want if it won't be successful anyway? It gives me enormous freedom and joy. I mean, I still feel pain for not being successful enough, but I also feel enormous joy that is greater than the pain I feel.
It strikes me that some of the changes in publishing, which people ask about all the time, the pressure to be on TikTok to promote your books and things like that, the absurdity of all that makes it easier to feel distance from it, to feel like that's not something you're going to do as a serious writer, and it's easier to separate from it. Does that make sense? That there's a sense that there'll be an article in the Times every week about how, okay, authors are having to jump through hoops to do this or that or the other thing, and I wonder if that just feels totally foreign to the work that you want to do.
Well, this is exactly what I talk about, that I feel liberated by my lack of success. I don't have to do any of that.
I love social media. Follow me at Shteyngart. Twitter and Instagram. I don't know, I have a lot of fun. Instagram, it's mostly photos of me drinking martinis, which I do very well. But different scenarios of me drinking martinis. And Twitter's political crap and whatever, No, it's fun. I sometimes, I'm thinking about something, because I write very contemporarily. I could never write, a historical novel, sorry, but that's up to you folks. I have no idea what the hell happened, Even when I was writing my memoir, I took it seriously in a kind of journalistic way, and I sat my parents down and I interviewed them for freaking hours. Then I took them back to Petersburg and had them walk around and found out insane things. My father had spent part of his time in a mental asylum. All this stuff that I had no idea about. Everything was so, but I took that kind of fact-checking very, very, very seriously. But I could never write a historical novel. I write about the present time. So for me, Twitter, Instagram, it's sort of being connected to the pulse of things. And then even though I may write about something very different, people really, because people don't censor themselves as much on some of these media, you really feel like you understand, well, mostly how awful people are. But sometimes you're surprised, too, by some act of Twitter kindness. But yeah, they don't make me do it, but I kind of like it. I don't know, I'm crazy.
I think it just it tells more about your personality. You love it. It's fun for you. And so you don't just do it to promote your work. You do it for fun.
And in fact, I would say I think it's a myth among publishers. They see you have 500,000 followers. They think, oh, yeah. But people don't, it doesn't really work like that.
Yes, exactly. Because I hated it, torture for me to be on social media and to respond to comments. It's really, really awful for me. So I enjoy not being that I don't have to do it. But for you, I mean, you're not doing it for some greedy purpose.
No, it doesn't generate anything. Although, you know what it generates is funny assignments. So I just wrote a piece for The Atlantic about cruising on the world's most horrifying cruise ship. And the way I got that assignment was I put a picture up of this horrible-looking ship, and this was before its maiden voyage, and I said, I'm willing to cruise on this ship. Please specify the level of sarcasm desired. And 3 hours later, my Atlantic editor calls yeah, you're getting on that ship.
They spent a ton of money to get you there.
Yeah, exactly. So that came about because of Twitter. But Twitter reminds me of is when I made my first American friends, I spoke with an accent for a while, and I didn't know English, blah, 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 the usual immigrant stuff. But and I was in this Hebrew school where the rabbi kept yelling at me because I would try to make jokes about the Torah. So I wrote my own version of the Torah called the Genora, because my nickname was Gary Gnu, and this became the Genora. And that's how I made my first American friends, through satire, because all the kids would pay me to look at the new pages of the Genora that I would write. And again, when I was writing it, I didn't have an accent. I was 9, 10 years old. I didn't have an accent on the page. A lot of misspellings and grammatical errors for sure, but so to me, the Twitter is kind of like that. It's like being the class clown again, being able to go to that, which to me feels like a safe space, as they say. I feel very safe when I'm doing that.
I'm going to remind everyone that we're going to turn to Q&A soon, so please, if you haven't already, take a card that you've been handed and write a question as shocking or embarrassing as you can imagine, because your name's not on it. And I'll ask a couple other questions, and then we'll turn to that. I was thinking, because these are mostly professors and teachers here, to ask you both about the teaching you do and how that's going in these difficult times, but also to the degree that there's a whole generation of post-Soviet, American people who probably look to your books as a kind of model of some sort, or to figure out who they are, or to ask questions about who they are. I wonder, how you feel about like that generation younger than you, who might look to your books for some sort of wisdom, understanding, insight, and come to you with those demands or requests.
So I just love teaching, and it inspires me, and my classes are about, they are not like freewheeling discussions of our favorite books. They are very formal, very structured. They're about certain skills of writing. And I feel like the students are incredibly smart, and sometimes they offer ideas that I take for myself. So I think like I do mentor a lot of students. None of them Russian, I think. But I also feel that I'm getting as much from this relationship as a writer as they are. And I just thought of something strange, because I just, about what style is. I asked GPT chat to write something in the style of Lara Vapnyar. And it was just, very disappointing. Like Boris met Svetlana but didn't want to marry her. Instead, he wanted to marry Natalia. And I thought, oh, it just doesn't have a sense of humor. Sometimes I feel that, like, what is it? How can you be inspired by someone's style? What does it mean? And then I asked GPT chat to ask something in your style, and it was exactly the same. Oh, no. No, less love, but oh God. But no humor.
No humor.
No humor.
Well, that's what ChatGPT can't do.
Yeah.
It's not funny. Jewish humor and ChatGPT are in different worlds.
So the question of influence is very strange. Like chat could not.
I asked ChatGPT, because I blurb a lot of books, as you were saying, and I asked ChatGPT to just start blurbing all the books that were coming through. And I'd read the back flap and be like, blurb it, in my style. And it was completely humorless and just bullshit. I just couldn't believe it. I like teaching too. I love teaching. It exhausts me. I don't know if it exhausts you. I teach 3 months a year, and then I take 9 months to recover. It's exhausting, but they're really sweet, and they're at Columbia. They're spending $160 grand for this. God help all of them. So we all take it very seriously there, because we know that they're taking it very seriously. They're putting their financial lives on the line. I feel like, I don't know. I love the idea of a community of writers, because I think. There's, I guess, that whole Brooklyn scene. I'm not a part of it because I can't afford to live in Brooklyn. I live in Manhattan. But there's, it feels like a real community. And so I try to have a very convivial environment. Workshops, we have, it's graduates, so there's drinks and food and whiskey and stuff like that. It feels like, I don't know, the old days of Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's the community I've always wanted to have when I was growing up, so I kind of want to replicate it for them. And so many of our students are very successful. That's one reason I'm constantly writing blurbs, is because they're always getting published. But it's really, it's a wonderful, humbling experience, and I could never give it up. I always leave feeling very content about what I've done. I don't always love what I write, but I always love teaching other people to write.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then while you answer, I'm going to read these cards more carefully so that I know what to say. The question I'm going to ask you is, do you have any favorite literary or cultural representations of New York that like stand out to you that you would want to tell this room of people about? And if not, just hem and haw for a while I read these cards.
I'm sure I have. I've read so many novels and short stories about New York, but for some reason I'm blanking right now. I'm sure it will come to me in a few minutes.
I teach a class on immigrant fiction, and we always start with a modernist Jewish novel called Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. Yeah, oh, we're snapping, great. Yeah, that is incredible. I mean, that is page by page. Geez, I thought my childhood was brutal. This poor kid, David Sherrill, damn. Things really sucked for him. But it's also an evocation, I mean, because obviously we know American Jews, native-born American Jews, but I never quite understood what their ancestry was like. I mean, obviously their parents had made the right choice to leave the Pale of Settlement before we did. But to me, it's fascinating because it's also it's a book. I guess you could call it immigrant fiction because it is. He's a 5-year-old immigrant child. But it also shows you how it's not just a young immigrant family dealing with the stressors of not knowing the language and assimilation and all these things, but it's about turning inward and all the problems that the family had back in the old country and just gets transplanted. Nothing changes. You know, you don't land here back then at Ellis Island, now at JFK or whatever, and all of a sudden, hey, all those problems go away because you're so busy being American. All the problems, all the things continue. One of the big questions I always wanted to ask in my fiction, being able to survey my parents so well, is to try to understand what part of them is historical and what part of them is their own personalities. Because when I meet so many of their parents, the issues, and when people of my generation talk amongst each other, we always talk about, it's always like we have the same two parents. You know, that's obviously not the case, but you know, Hitler and Stalin really did a number on them. So to me, I'm always curious as to what the historical part of a personality, and that includes myself as well, obviously, since you know, growing up first in the Soviet Union and then under Reagan, et cetera, all these things also had a big effect. So Call It Sleep, books like that are immigrant fiction is a strange category, and some people really push back against it because, you know, they say, well, all fiction in America other than Native American fiction is immigrant fiction. Yeah, Call It Sleep is something and it's amazing, because it's a very difficult book in a kind of Joycean modernist tone, but they really like it, the young people. Yeah.
Okay, so we have some good questions here. I'm going to try to vary between the ridiculous ones and the less ridiculous ones. The first one is, Lara, if Gary were a building in New York, which would he be? Gary, same question.
And do we have to be a famous building or any old, shed?
It didn't specify, so I think you're really free.
Oh. Wow, that's a good thought exercise. I don't know, let's see. Building. Huh. Maybe, no. See, I have an impetus to say something like the Russian and Turkish baths, but that's too on the nose, so to speak. It can't be anything Russian. Let's make that a rule.
No, it can be Russian. And it's so hard to answer this question about each other. I would be able to answer the question about myself.
Okay, so then you can confer and just give the answer to Gary. And
it has to be a particular building.
I guess, or a style of building, I suppose.
Style of building.
I want to say that I am like Chrysler building, but I know I am not at all.
Do you have a building you aspire to be?
You know, I love, well, actually, maybe a building I used to live in that I deeply loved. It was, well, actually, I had a Jewish background. It was the old co-ops by the FDR Drive, the Jewish garment union co-ops, Grand Street, on Grand Street, Amalgamated. Yeah. You live there now? Oh, you're so freaking lucky. I lived there for 5 years in 575 Grand Street, East River. Jesus, wow. And that was the best place I ever lived. It was so awesome. It looked, people actually would say it looked more like Moscow, those giant high-rises, and I don't know Moscow very well, but they're giant, very socialist-looking buildings. And I just thought all of it was great. You had a balcony. When I married my wife, she wanted to be closer to Penn Station because she goes to Boston a lot, so we moved to we're around the corner here. But I miss everything about those buildings. Those buildings felt like me. All the board of Shiva, you know, because everyone's always dying in those buildings. They're all Jews, you know. So you'd go and you'd be like, oh, 5G is free. All right, you know, 10F, here we go. Free matzahs, and then, you know, you can buy the apartment. That was heaven. Both the socialist, the Jewish, every aspect of me was represented by those buildings. That's me, yeah.
But not me.
Oh, maybe it's you. Okay, I'll give it to you. You take them.
Yeah, thank you.
575 Grand Street, right here.
Thank you. Because it feels so much like me.
What is it? Kutuzovsky Prospect, that big thoroughfare in Moscow with all the giant buildings? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, here's a different one at a different speed. A question in hypothetical history to the fiction writers. What if your families immigrated to Israel instead of New York? How do you think about these contrasting answers to the Jewish question from the perspective of today or throughout your life?
I really, I struggled all my life with my Jewish identity. And I have no idea what my life would turn out to be like in Israel. But I think I would have a stronger, clearer sense of my Jewish identity for sure.
Good, clean answer. I like that. Yeah, it's interesting. When my books are published in Israel and I would go and visit, I would always end up drinking with a bunch of ex-Soviets, and they would say they're way more messed up than the protagonists of, say, my novels and other novels. They feel it's much more difficult, everything is much more difficult. And they talk about a kind of prejudice toward them that I experienced when I was, you know, they used to call me the stinky Russian bear because I had this big fur shapka, and the kids would make fun of me. But in Israel, I think the level of, I don't know, it's more conformist maybe. I'm just throwing it out there. And it was more difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And also, as I was alluding to a certain piece I'd written in the New Yorker about a certain procedure that many Jewish men undergo, a lot of people in Israel, a lot of Soviet Jews of my generation talk in very hushed tones about it, but are very understanding of that, because in Israel it was like a, what do you call those lines when cars are, like assembly line of doctors just cutting schlongs left, you know, and left and right, and many have developed equal problems as I have.
But you think they would done a better job?
No, I think worse even. Because this was
even worse.
Even worse. As bad as Coney Island Hospital was, I don't think Israel had better schlong cutters. So I do feel a connection to them, but I think from just, and again, maybe it's because they read my work that they already are miserable people, but in a good way. But they seem to be even more messed up by the immigrant experience than I was. So yeah, I mean, look, the best guy for all this is Bismuth. He ended up in Canada, the greatest country on earth. So, as you know from Toronto. But yeah, and my parents were thinking about all these different, because when we were in Rome, there's some Jewish, I guess, is it called a Jewish agency? Some agency kept trying to get my dad, because he was a Soviet engineer like all of them, and they were trying to get him to move to Israel. And he wanted to, but my mom was like, no. And also South Africa, all these different countries wanted Soviet Jews and their incredible engineering skills. But overall, New York I'm really happy I did end up here, yeah.
Okay, I have two, like one for each of you, and we can think of it as a study in how this audience has reacted. Okay, so first, for Lara, may I ask which of your novels is a masterpiece? I would like to read it. You could say a few words about it.
Divide Me by Zero. It's really hard to talk about it. It's very personal. It's about love and death, but when which great novel isn't about these two subjects? And it is great, trust me.
Okay.
I never said that about any of my other novels.
Okay, and then this is another card. Gary, I enjoyed your cruise piece. What do you think of Disney World?
Thank you for reading the cruise piece. By the way, people are leaving messages on my phone. I'm going to kill you, blah, blah, blah. The cruisers are so angry about that piece. I have, if I die tomorrow...
They're very loyal.
It's a cult, you know, it's a cult. And they're very loyal. So if I die tomorrow, you know who did it. Somebody from the Love Boat.
But maybe Schlong cutters.
What?
Schlong cutters.
Short others?
Schlong cutters.
Oh, Schlong cutters.
Could have done it.
Schlong, of course. Yes. Oh, yeah, I incensed a lot of Israeli Schlong cutters. Yeah, one moil went bananas. I mean, yeah, so either cruise people or the Schlongsters. Wait, what was the question? Oh, Disney World. Well, we went to Disney World as, and I wrote about this in my memoir, but also if you Google 69 cents, it was a little piece I wrote about going to Disney World with my parents when I was, I guess, 12, I want to say, or 13, around there. And I was very excited, you know, who wouldn't be? But instead of flying there, they drove in our friend's old Oldsmobile. And then instead of going to any of the restaurants, they bought all these Russian foods, big baguettes of bread, bulka, vinaigrette, this beet salad, right? And so we would stop at McDonald's, which was always my dream, to eat this 69-cent hamburger. And instead of eating the food at McDonald's, they would put everything out from their coolers and then borrow all the utensils and straws.
I did that,
You did
to
that
my
too.
kids. Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
My poor kids.
This was, see, your poor kids, and that is, it was. Every part of this trip was a different kind of humiliation. So yes, I met the mouse, but I was like, I'm so sorry. I got vinaigrette stains all over me. There's beets everywhere. But yeah, I haven't been to Las Vegas yet, so that's one more thing I can trash in essay form someday. If anyone is running a magazine. And, yeah.
Okay, so someone asked a question I imagine you've been asked a lot. Do you have a relationship to the Russian Jewish community here, I assume in New York? How do you relate to it?
I don't really understand what is Russian Jewish community, but most of my friends are Russian and Jewish.
Yeah, I think that's your relationship.
Yeah.
I have some Russian Jewish friends, but I don't. Is there even, what do we do? Like, is there a communal thing we do? Some kind of Lag BaOmer thing? I don't know. No, just, like I said, everyone in New York is Jewish, so yeah.
Okay. And another in the same sort of ballpark. Good luck. What changed for you after the invasion of Ukraine?
So for me, it was like I didn't have any illusions about Russia or Russian government or what's happening in Russia, but I did not expect this at all. It was a shock. I did not feel it was possible at all because like in most Russian Jewish families, half of my family comes from Ukraine, half from Russia. And to have like these two countries at war with each other. So it was like a pretty awful experience. For some reason, I was so depressed that I couldn't write for months. But then what happened in Israel was somehow I took it closer to heart that it was more shocking. So I feel even though I am like officially Russian American writer, I feel way more Jewish than I feel Russian or Ukrainian.
No, I was just like Lara. I was so. I just watched the news 24/7. I couldn't sleep. Also, half of my family Ukraine, 1/4 Belarusian, 1 Russian, 1/4 Russian. And I've always loved Ukraine because, and this is why it was invaded, because it felt like not a perfect democracy by any stretch, but something compared to Russia, a country desperately trying to run away from the Soviet way of living and toward Europe. And I would go to Kiev, and I made some great friends there. So it really felt, as I said, I already had a very strained relationship with Russia, partly because of what I've written about it, but also I just, I never have any hope for that place. For Ukraine, absolutely, but I remember once when I was just started going back to Petersburg, there was a restaurant there called 1913, and I asked the owner, why did you name it 1913? And she said, well, it was the only good year in Russian history. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I feel it's like all this country can do is damage to itself, to others. And it's, again, of course, we all grew up reading Chekhov, and there's so much there. But at the same time, I feel such a lack, and almost a shame, too. There's so much stuff that goes back, even the way we were brought up, Brighton Beach was considered Little Odessa, and all these snobby people were like, that's not for us, even though half of my ancestry is from, not Odessa, but around Western Ukraine. All kinds of snobbishness, and Brodsky's unbelievable poem about Ukraine, very anti-Ukrainian poem that he had written. So there's all this kind of strange stuff that began coming out of the woodwork for me and made me feel even less connected to the Russian part of myself. And that's when, my kid was born in 2013 and Crimea was invaded in 2014. So that was part of the reason, I think, why I thought, if he ever wants to learn it, it's up to him, but I'm through with that place,
I hesitated over this one. What do you think of academia, the left's current love affair with Marxism?
Well, I am actually lived part of my not really adult life. I left Russia when I was 21, but I know what Marxism is in real life, what it looks like, what people feel when there is a Soviet regime and when it's in power. So I think Marxism could lead to extremely dangerous thing, and people who just don't know enough history don't understand it.
I've never encountered Marxism in the writing program at Columbia. Marxist-free zone.
All right, I think this might be the one to close on.
Considering how expensive education is, yes, definitely.
Right, exactly.
Yes, it's too expensive for Marxists. Actually, maybe not. Oberlin was all Marxist, and it was pretty expensive.
This is maybe the note to end on. Someone is asking, what do you grow your mint for? Does it enhance the martinis? Is it for your diet? What can you tell us?
What a beautiful question. No, it's not for martinis. This is me also trying to assimilate, I do sometimes try to make, especially around racing season, a mint julep. Very difficult to make, as opposed to a martini, which is just gin and vermouth. But the mint just grows on the side of my building, and I just let it grow. That's the extent of my farming. And then I have a groundhog who tries to eat the mint. So most of my farming duties is trying to kill the groundhog. His name is Steve, and we hate each other to death. Hate Steve.
You've seen Caddyshack, I hope.
Yeah. Well, that's so funny. Caddyshack was one of the first films I saw in America. And I was just, I already couldn't make any sense of it. But I was like, why man pursue rodents like this? It was just... But now I am that man. I am Bill Murray,
Do you have any mint reason that you're growing mint?
Yes, this is also a cocktail. Sometimes I make mint tea, and it's beautiful. But the mint tea requires a lot of mint, and I growing mine on a windowsill, and it's just like this little tiny thing of mint, so it's only enough for cocktail. And my favorite cocktail is called Hyuga. It's from, I think it's popular in northern Italy. It's Prosecco, elderflower syrup, and mint. And it's beautiful.
I think we're going to say that on that note, please join me in thanking these two incredible writers for being with us today. And I think I don't know what's next, but I think there's some sort of hors d'oeuvres or something happening somewhere. And I don't know if some people brought books to be signed and you want to chase these people, but I don't know, you could try.
I'll sign anything.